Welcome to the second narrated PowerPoint. 6 effective practices in working with adult learners will help you focus on specific instructional practices that you may wish to consider when working with your adult learners. So, let's consider the learning target. Again, very simply, you should be able to identify effective practices in working with adult learners by the time you complete this presentation. Let's start off by thinking about what you might already know about practices for working with adult learners. In order to do this, please take a piece of paper, number 1 through 6. Just as we did before, I'll present you with 6 true-false items to respond to. Do the best you can with each item, and then we'll return to the items at the end of this narrated PowerPoint. Number 1. Transformative learning refers to extending already established cognitive capacities into new terrain. Number 2, the practice of critical reflection is an essential component of pedagogy and andragogy. And number 3, motivation for adults does not always lie within the learner, but in the dynamic tension that exists between the learner and the sociocultural world. Number 4, in adult learning, the assumption is that knowledge that is co-created is greater than the sum of each individual member's knowledge. Number 5, a talk aloud is a process that encourages self-reflection. And number 6, research in andragogy supports the notion that the adult educator should function as a disseminator of knowledge. As we did in the first PowerPoint presentation, let's begin with an advanced organizer of the 6 effective practices in working with adult learners. We'll then delve into each practice in more detail. Again, the disclaimer is that not all practices may be effective in working with all adults at all times. First, keep the focus on the transformation of the learner, not the transmission of knowledge. Second, foster critical reflection in which learners examine their assumptions, reevaluate their conclusions, and reformulate new ways of thinking and being. And third, focus on connections between theory and practice to provide solutions to real-world problems. As we work through each practice, I'm going to give you time to ponder selected quotes before I add brief narration. Throughout the process, I'd like you to consider what you could say and do to put each of these 6 practices in action with your adult learners. Fourth, create an environment that brings about respectful engagement and an opportunity to create knowledge. Fifth, use transparent communication and talk alouds to encourage self-reflection. And sixth, facilitate learning rather than disseminate knowledge. As mentioned before, I'll give you time to read this slide before adding my narration. Of primary importance in adult learning is your commitment as an adult educator to being learner-centered. The focus must be on the transformation of the learner, not just the transmission of your knowledge. One of the best ways to bring this about is through what's called dialogue learning. Basically, this is where you engage your learners in reflecting, rehearsing, practicing, and conversing with alternative understandings. Let's keep exploring this idea of learner-centered versus subject-centered learning in the next slide. Transformative or transformational, terms used interchangeably in the literature, learning is about change. Dramatic, fundamental change in the way we see ourselves and the world in which we live. Unlike informational learning, which refers to extending already established cognitive capacities into new terrain, transformational learning refers to changing what we know. The mental construction of experience, inner meaning, and reflection are common components of this approach. We said earlier that adults generally prefer a problem-solving orientation to learning, rather than a subject-centered learning. Furthermore, they learn best when new information is presented in a real-life context. As a result, The experiential approach to learning has become firmly rooted in adult learning practice. David Kolb has been a leader in advancing the practice of experiential learning. He defines learning as the process whereby knowledge is created through transformation of experience. For Kolb, learning is not so much the acquisition or transmission of content as the interaction between content and experience, whereby each transforms the other. The educator's job, he says, is not only to transmit or implant new ideas, but also to modify old ones that may get in the way of new ones. A second practice to consider is fostering critical reflection. This is when your adult learners will examine their assumptions, reevaluate their conclusions, and reformulate new ways of thinking and being. The process of critical reflection is not always easy to learn. Indeed, it often requires the developmental capacities that only come with maturity. According to Robert Kagan, it is a uniquely adult capacity to become critically self-reflective. Thus, a strong program for working with an adult should be developmentally appropriate and build on the awareness that adults are physiologically capable of making conceptual connections between theory and practice, and are able to critically examine their own underlying assumptions and biases. In order for the intrapersonal process to involve a shift from dissonance to synthesis and result in increased cognitive complexity, dialogue education must be grounded in a safe, secure, authentic, and supportive relational context between the instructor and the learner. Without this positive relational environment, the prospects for learning are diminished. The learner must willfully open space within himself or herself to allow the alternative knowledge to transform his or her prior understandings. Adult programs should not exist solely to encourage adults toward critical reflection or critical judgment. Rather, adult learning should also focus on the conceptual connections between theory and practice in a way that's relevant and helpful in providing practical solutions to real-world problems. The learning that adults do arises from the context of their lives, which is intimately tied to the socio-cultural setting in which they live. As Jarvis has observed, learning is about the continuing process of making sense of everyday experience. Jarvis also draws a connection between motivation and context. He says, the reason for participation does not always lie within the learner, but in the dynamic tension that exists between the learner and the socio-cultural world. The potential for learning occurs at the intersection of us and our world. Adults usually want to know more about anything that benefits them. They often want to be better, quicker, and more creative in doing what they value. Creating an environment of respectful engagement is the challenge of the adult educator. In adult learning, the assumption is that knowledge that is co-created is greater than the sum of each individual member's knowledge. You and your adult learners have a part to play in each other's learning. Learner and teacher are co-responsible for the outcome of the educational experience. At the same time, there is the recognition that power is not equally shared between teacher and learner. The teacher is in an ascribed position of power, and he or she is in an evaluative capacity, having to make judgments about student performance that arranges the relationship somewhat hierarchically. The core principle that adults need to know why before they engage in learning has led to the now generally accepted premise that adults should be engaged in a collaborative planning process for their learning. Engaging adults as collaborative partners for learning satisfies their need to know as well as appealing to their self-concept as independent learners. Knoll suggested that the classroom climate should be one of adultness, both physically and psychologically. The climate should cause adults to feel accepted, respected, and supported. Further, There should exist a spirit of mutuality between the instructor and learners as joint inquirers. Being self-directed also means that adult learners can participate in the diagnosis of their learning needs, the planning and implementation of the learning experiences, and the evaluation of those experiences. One of the most effective ways for adult educators to model desirable behaviors in the classroom is through a process of transparent communication known as a talk aloud. Ideally, you and your learners are partners in the learning process. Adults learn the skills of self-reflection and challenging one's own assumptions by following the example set by their facilitator. This results in an adult's progressively enhanced capacity to validate prior learning through reflective discourse and to act upon the resulting insights. Finally, the posture of the adult educator is to be a facilitator of learning rather than a disseminator of knowledge. One aspect of the educational practice that most sharply differentiates pedagogy from andragogy is the movement from teaching to the facilitating of the learning experience. It is important to note that this involves including the learner in planning responsibilities. In the past, responsibility for planning traditionally has been assigned almost exclusively to an authority figure. But this practice is so glaringly in conflict with the adult learner's need to be self-directing that a cardinal principle of andragogy is violated if this occurs on all occasions. The facilitator role may appear to be more casual, but it actually requires increased attentiveness to what is happening in the work and life of the adult learner. Okay, let's return to each of our anticipation guide items and see how you did. Item number 1. Transformative learning refers to extending already established cognitive capacities into new terrain. That's actually false. Transformative learning refers to dramatic fundamental change in the way we see ourselves and changing what we know. Number 2. The practice of critical reflection is an essential component of pedagogy and andragogy. That actually is false. Critical reflection is a uniquely adult capacity. Number 3, motivation for adults does not always lie within the learner, but in a dynamic tension that exists between the learner and the sociocultural world. That item is true. Number 4, in adult learning, the assumption is that knowledge that is co-created is greater than the sum of each individual member's knowledge. That is true. Number 5, a talk aloud is a process that encourages self-reflection. That's true as well. And number 6, research in andragogy supports the notion that the adult educator should function as a disseminator of knowledge. That is false. Adult educators should serve as a facilitator of learning. Now, it's time for some additional homework. What I'd like you to do at this point is to reflect on something that you could say and do to put each of the practices in action with your adult learners. The next 4 slides contain the references for the PowerPoint presentation that you just viewed. Please feel free to do some additional reading in any of these resources. Thank you for joining me in this presentation, and I wish you well as you work with the adult learners that God has entrusted to you.